Hello, space friends. Welcome back to another week of the Launch Sequence podcast. I'm your host, Space Tomato, and today I am joined by another Star Citizen YouTuber. Nice mustache in the camera screen there, Mr. Farrister. Thanks for joining me today. How are you doing?
All good, thank you. Thank you for inviting me back.
Of course, yeah. I have been watching your videos a little bit lately and remembered I have been wanting to get... We talked about doing a show a couple weeks ago, and timing didn't really work out. Glad you're able to join me today. Episode 103. We're going to talk today about whether Star Citizen is ready for you to put the time into. That's obviously kind of a loaded question because everybody's got different opinions of what means ready to play. But today we're going to take an open-ended approach. We're going to talk about just feelings about the stability glitches. Obviously, the 30Ks have been plaguing a lot of people with 319, 318 with PES caused a lot of instability. And also, we're seeing a lot of stuff with the game loops and things coming in. So, there's good things and bad things happening. Thought we could summarize it here over an hour with some tea, water, and coffee, and just have a nice kickback chat. So let's start with you, Farrister, because there are probably plenty of people who are listening to this podcast and haven't been or weren't listening last time you were on. So can you let the folks know kind of what you do and how you're related to Star Citizen?
Yeah, so I've been playing Star Citizen since the Hangar module was released, so quite a few years now. Maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, I said, actually, I'd quite like to start making some videos about the game itself and kind of some of the things that we do in the game. So I make videos over on YouTube. It's at youtube.com/Farrister. I'm probably best known for making ship review videos. So I'll talk about how ships currently perform in the game. And then also just getting out and about and exploring different places in the verse. I think it's very easy in the gameplay loops we do have to get focused on doing your salvaging or doing your mining, and I love doing all of that stuff, but also just taking the time out to admire the models, admire how the game is put together, and I guess trying to be a positive idea for what we could get in the future for Star Citizen.
Yeah, I really like your location reviews. They're not location based videos in this game aren't like the best to make in terms of attracting views or getting people's attention. But they're valuable because there's so many different locations and they all have different names and they're easy to forget. Love the nice, relaxing walkthroughs that you do of those. Folks, he did mention the link for his YouTube. That'll be linked down below in the show notes. Check it out if you haven't already. So let's talk about the game right now. Let's just start out basic. How would you describe Star Citizen in Alpha 319?
So I think the way that I always pitch it in my own mind is I probably see this a little differently to others. I see this as a playable game. So I need to qualify this comment. So there are lots of problems in Star Citizen. There are lots of issues in Star Citizen, and there are a lot of missing features. But as something that you can log in and rack up the hours doing something enjoyable as an early access kind of game, I do see Star Citizen as playable. You know, I spend a lot of time every single week just playing the game, grinding my AUEC balance. And I think I do in my mind see it as that kind of unfinished, very unfinished, but playable title. I think the most important thing that I would always say to anybody that's thinking about what is now the time is to do it with your eyes open. This is not a polished, complete title. Although, to be fair, some of the polished releases for this year for other titles perhaps didn't go so well. But don't expect Star Citizen to be a finished article. Expect problems, expect challenges. But with your eyes open to a lot of that, it can still be an enjoyable game, I think.
So you say it is playable. It's something that you think of as a playable experience, but not polished.
Yeah, I mean, I play it. I play it every single week. You know, you can log in on Twitch and regularly see people streaming, playing the game. It's playable, right?
Yeah.
Depending on what you want to do. There are some gameplay loops that if you're like, oh, I'm really into repair, well, sorry, you might need to wait for that. But in terms of the core of the game, I think, yes, you can log in and play the game every single week.
And you said that you get in, you're grinding for AUEC. For anybody who doesn't know, that's just the alpha currency for the alpha and not the actual game. what are you usually trying to earn money for? Do you have actual goals, or are you just obtaining wealth?
Obtaining wealth the British way. No, I do have actual goals. So I mentioned before that a lot of people tune into my YouTube channel now to see Star Citizen ship reviews, specifically for how those ships perform in the game. I'm in no way connected with CIG, so my only way of getting those ships is to buy them with Alpha UEC in the game. So the primary way that I keep the YouTube channel moving along and keep people interested is by buying the ships in game, and that requires that I play the game and rack up the hours earning the in-game credits.
See, folks, you can make money by playing video games. He's turning his AUEC into real UEC. Well, okay, that's still fake money. Whatever. It's a return though. That's actually a really cool process. You are working in game to make your channel in real life work around the in-game work. I like it.
Yeah, I don't know that my channel earns that much compared to what I've spent on all of the different
it's
kit
something.
that I need. But
It's something,
it
and
is.
it's interesting to see how that can be, how you can leverage something like YouTube to do that.
And I enjoy playing the game, right?
Mhm.
So, in terms of the things that I do in game to make credits, I tend to do either the shipborne combat contracts and fly around my Ares Inferno starfighter, or I'll be in my prospector mining away. And I find both of those loops satisfying. So I'm enjoying my time, right? I'm not feeling aggrieved that I'm having to slave away at Star Citizen. No, I enjoy my time in the game. And yes, there are frustrations and things that get in the way, but in my own mind, I'm okay with that. It's part of where the game's at the moment, and that doesn't spoil the enjoyment for me. But again, I think this comes back to me saying I think people need to have their eyes open to exactly where Star Citizen is. For some people, that would just be too much. Do you know what? I'd rather wait. I'll wait until it's more fleshed out, more finished, more polished. But for other people, they go, actually, yeah, do you know what? It's not complete, but I could have a good time with that. So I think that the information and the sort of podcast that you're doing right now is valuable for that.
Yeah, and that's part of why we do episodes like this. Is like a lot of people are following the game but not playing, and it's nice to get little updates like this from that stuff. Let's talk about the game loops. You mentioned that you are able to jump in the game, do several game loops over the weeks, and get good money and good gameplay out of it. I want to kind of quantify for people just how many game loops are in the game right now, because sometimes it can seem like there's a very small amount. So I want to go through each game loop, starting from the least developed to the most developed. And I think we can kind of talk about what they include. And then I want to maybe estimate how many hours you think somebody could get for a fresh gameplay out of that. So let's start with investigation gameplay. Now that's a weird one because we have like the Covalix mission, but we also have some other missions around the verse with caves and stuff. What do you think of investigative stuff?
I think it's pretty basic what's in the game at the moment. I think for somebody that enjoys exploring, figuring stuff out, they can be a useful starting point. I'm trying to think the last time I did an investigation mission. But I think it's probably quite a shallow lake that you're swimming in there. I don't think there's going to be too much. That said, I think when I've seen developers talking about investigation missions, a lot of what they're talking about is what we've got at the moment are very curated missions. They've been put together specifically for a purpose. But a lot of what the developers have talked about in the future is going to be, they almost have building blocks in the background, and then you've got almost procedurally generated investigation type missions, which I think is where things could potentially ramp up and create much deeper, more meaningful gameplay. That said, there's still lots of things for players interested in that kind of things to still explore in the game, albeit potentially not for Alpha UEC benefit. So, for example, there is a location in and around Crusader in the game at the moment, which has an interesting story behind it in game. Players will know it as Bennyhenge, and I'm kind of trying not to spoil too much because if you're into investigation type things, there is actually a series of in-game cues that can lead you to that location by doing some investigation. There's nothing to gain from it, but there are some little clues around the verse that could lead you to find that place just by reading data pads and things like that. So
yes,
there are
I
things
love that.
and there are things in game like that don't necessarily have a benefit attached to them, but for somebody who's interested in exploring or finding out more, they're there to be found.
Yeah, that is very cool. I didn't realize that there were queues that you could follow to Bennyhenge. I thought it was just kind of But yeah, the Bennyhenge, the Javelin crashed on Daymar. There are a couple things that have been left around for like sandbox investigative gameplay, which is cool. The scanning functions and things are just not there to back it up though. But the missions that you're talking about are, the cave, where you have to go into the cave to find the person. Sometimes you can't find the person. Sometimes you get down there and you get lost and somebody has to find you. They are very clunky right now, but the modular missions that they've talked about replacing them with sound really cool. I really hope that we can see the stuff that is investigative inside of other missions. So like you're doing some kind of a good example would be the Tisha Pacheco mission. Price of Freedom, I think it's called, where you have to go in and break somebody out. It'd be cool if you get to that ship and then you have to do more investigative stuff than just get a data pad and match a number. You have to like go around the ship and figure out why you can't get through a certain door or something. That kind of stuff would be awesome to include inside of other missions.
I agree. And I know we might talk about some of the other gameplay loops here, but I think this is where, as more and more basic gameplay is introduced, you almost get a critical mass of being able to mix things up. So, for example, you might have a combination of investigation and also, there might be some salvage attached, or, you might need to do some clever engineer style stuff to redirect relays in order to open a door so that you can continue the investigation and things like that. And for me, that's where even small elements, so incomplete gameplay loops, but at a very, very basic level, I think Starstead doesn't like to refer to it as tier 0. Once you can layer a lot of that stuff on top of each other, suddenly those missions become a lot more dynamic. It's not just an investigation mission. You'll have chance to learn or deploy new skills as part of that. And that's where I think things will really start to accelerate for the player experience, because suddenly you've got so much more to each of those kind of experiences.
Yeah. So from investigation gameplay in the game right now, how many hours would you say, just spitballing, how many hours do you think somebody could get out of that and still feel fresh?
Maybe 3 to 5. Maybe I'm being pessimistic there.
3
Maybe
to 5.
Disagree.
Okay, so that's not going to give you much to go with. Let's move on to the next bit then. What would you say is like the next least developed sort of way somebody could make money in the game right now?
Well, I think there are some very low developed ways that are perhaps even more low developed than investigation. So maybe personnel transportation, in theory.
Oh,
Players
like
can
beacons.
lodge beacons. Yeah, players can lodge beacons and say, hey, come pick me up and take me to Port Olisar. That's very, very basic, and it's ultimately player driven at the moment, but in theory it's a way you could make money.
Yeah, that's like nonstop sandbox gameplay. And then bouncing off of that, the medical beacons are kind of the same. You're not limited to what the game is offering at that point. You're limited to what players are doing.
Yeah, and then to an even more extreme extent, there's refueling mechanics. So if you have a Starfarer and you can coordinate with somebody in F12 chat, you can drive your Starfarer to where they are and refuel them for credits through the in-game refueling system. But again, there's no beacon for that. It's purely player-driven.
Yeah, very, very small amount of support for that to actually be fostered in the game. So generally, it's only done if you've got like an org that's setting up an event or something like that. Hopefully we see that sort of fleshed out a little bit more before Pyro.
Yeah.
All right, going in the other direction from investigation then, I guess something like mercenary missions?
Yeah, I think the combat contracts across both first person and shipborne are actually fairly well fleshed out at this point. They were some of the first ways of making reliable money in game. And in terms of what's on there, there's a bit of variety. So you've got, on the ship side of things, you've got things like the urgent assistance required, get out there and help out, or you've got the, specific go and find this person in this place to take them out and things like that. You've also got things like the claim jumpers, where you've got more static defenses. And then on the first person side, you've also got things like the bunker missions where you've got defended or undefended locations and things like that. So I think there's more variety in the combat series of missions at the moment. And then, of course, on top of that, that's all the player versus environment stuff. You've also got potentially player versus player opportunities where you get the thing that pops up that says, hey, go find Avenger 1 and we'll give you some money. You've got all of those elements in there as well. So I think this is probably more fleshed out, and it's further supported by one mission, which is called a call to arms, which basically means any bad character, bad actor, criminal character in the game that you take out through doing anything else in the verse will also give you some credits. So I've got a memory in mind this year, went to visit the new cave at Daymar and explore kind of like the crashed Whistler's Crypt location. It was really cool. And there were loads of NPC characters walking around. And I was just my Crusader Ares Inferno. I had Call to Arms active, pulled the trigger on some of these guys, and I was getting some little credits for taking out some bad actors while I was exploring. So for me, that is probably one of the more advanced elements of the game, because you can take advantage of it in lots of different ways.
Definitely a proud sign of the healthy society that is Star Citizen. Go murder these people without no questions asked. We'll pay you. Just keep
They're
it up.
bad people. They're bad people.
Of course, right? According to the UEE. I like that you grouped up mercenary and bounty hunting gameplay together, because I think they've always been sort of parallels of each other, but also not even doing what they're meant to be. So for starters, I agree with you. I think having that combat gameplay around for so long not only made them a little bit more developed, it also skewed the idea of Star Citizen, I think. A lot of people think of Star Citizen as a very combat-focused game, and I think a lot of that comes from just industrial gameplay not being able to, and science gameplay not being able to be made until features were around. We could shoot at each other for like 10 years now. But mercenary and bounty hunting work probably is going to change quite a bit, right? In the future, we're already looking at bounty hunting updates. What do you think of the direction they're going with that?
I like that. So you're right. I did group them together because in terms of the current gameplay, I see them as much of the same thing.
Yeah.
If you take a bounty hunter mission, it says, go to this place. Here's a spot on your mini map so you know exactly where you're going, and kill this character that's there, or otherwise apprehend the individual. In the long term, I think this is where the mix of missions will become much more interesting, because eventually I see bounty hunter, from what I've kind of heard from the developer comments, as being almost that mix of investigation and combat, and you're going to need to be proficient at both. So actually tracking down your target, it won't be here's a mini-map location that updates every time they come out of quantum travel. It will be find the clues, work it out, use your sensors, all this kind of clever stuff. And then when you do find them, you're going to need the skills to be able to apprehend them, depending on how combat savvy the target is. So for me, that's where Bounty Hunter will really come into its own, because it's the hunter part of that, rather than just go to this place and blast away. So yeah. I think that's where we might start to see more of a distinction. And of course, there are ships in game that then potentially introduce specialized gameplay around that. Things like the Cutlass Blue with the Bounty Hunter character pods in the back. Potentially you could start to see some more different things. So I agree with you. In the future, I'd love to see more variety there, but at the moment it's kind of all just a blast away.
Yeah. Right now it is very much just go here, shoot that person, come back. It's not very in depth. Between the two, bounty hunting and mercenary work, let's again spitball. How many hours do you think somebody could get of, let's say they enjoy FPS or ship combat until they got bored of this kind of stuff? How many hours do you think somebody could put in?
So I think these are more developed, and I think by nature of them, it's almost you get more interested in the challenge. I think these become more unlimited depending on what you're playing the game for. So for me, I've got many, many hours doing the bounty hunter missions, for example, and I'm not bored of those. I will quite happily, if you said to me, hey, you don't have to work this afternoon, you can hop on with me and we'll go and hunt some stuff, I go, that sounds like a good time. I'll do that. So I think if you enjoy that sort of a gameplay, it's much more down to the individual, and especially for the player versus player side of it. If you do get bored of kind of shooting the AI and they become too predictable and things like that, suddenly you've got other players to go up against, and then you end up in this very, very different space of very dynamic and interesting encounters against other players. And again, when do you get bored of that? Well, it probably depends on you as an individual, but there are some people that love doing that. That's what they log into the game every day to do now. So I think that's where it starts to get more unlimited in the potential.
Yeah. And the mercenary work missions, generally they refer to mercenary work as FPS gameplay. So there are a lot of venues for that. You can go to Orison and fight in urban environments in the buildings. You can go to the orbit over ArcCorp and fight in an 890 jump that's been taken over by pirates. You can go down to underground facilities. You can go to even security post stations. There's a lot of places to FPS fight. So I think that's kind of similar in that you've got a lot of potential. It will start to get repetitive after, I would say, the first couple dozen hours, but like you could really benefit from this gameplay, not just because of these missions we're talking about, but because of the dynamic events that pop up, because of the PvP missions you can do, because of org gameplay, where all of this stuff kind of factors into that same skill and ability to do that. So this is it's a good segment of gameplay, the combat part. I do hope that the non-lethal stuff that would come with bounty hunting, we start to see more of this summer so we can understand how that's going to work. What would be next on your list?
I think I would probably place cargo in next.
Okay.
So cargo trading, cargo hauling, i.e. going to a place, buying some stuff, going to another place and selling it for a profit. It's historically, it was one of the best ways to make Alpha UEC in the game, to make your credits. And the system hasn't really changed much on the front end since it was first launched. There have been some back end changes with how the cargo works on board the ship. There have been some kind of minor changes for things like disconnection protection and things like that. But broadly speaking, the gameplay loop is very similar. Go to a place, buy a thing, go to another place, sell it for more than you paid for it.
Yeah, it's basically trading, right? You're not even really getting the chance to haul without putting your own money into it, which is a common criticism.
It is, and for me, that's there's a couple of easy wins. I'll call them easy wins. I'm not a game developer. It's easy for me to say, hey, this would be really easy to do, but if you've actually got to program it, it might be more difficult. But for me, there's a couple of easy wins on cargo trading that I don't feel would be too difficult, that would add a lot to experience. And the first is versus owning the cargo yourself, being more of a cargo hauling for hire. So let's say you've got a C2 Hercules, a great big cargo ship in the game. At the moment, you have to fill that up with stuff that you acquire on your own. The most common way to do that is by buying cargo to put on there. There are a couple of other routes, things like you could acquire somebody else's cargo over a long period of time through nefarious ways, or you could perhaps go and mine some goods and use that to generate your own cargo pods. But let's say for the most part, you buy your own cargo. Well, that's not necessarily how things work in the real world. A lot of haulage firms and the big shipping companies, they don't own the cargo that they're transporting. Somebody else owns it. They get paid a fee for moving it from A to B. And for me, that would be a much more interesting way of doing cargo transfer, because suddenly you've got more dynamic options available. So first of all, you don't need to sink a huge amount of credits and put them at risk. All that you've got to risk is your own reputation and potentially the insurance timers. It potentially makes some of those large cargo haulers a little bit more accessible. I know I'm an M2 Hercules owner. It's a big cargo ship. Every time I log in after a server wipe, I can't afford to fill that ship up with the most valuable cargo until I've earned some money in the game. Whereas if these sort of contracts were available, potentially I could still be making money off of that ship doing the cargo hauling without so much of a risk. I think the other potentially interesting thing there is you could start to introduce more dynamics about the way in which cargo is hauled. So I'm thinking here about some of the large, and I mean really large cargo haulers, Hull D, Hull E. These things are the absolute massive kind of container tankers that you see in the real world. You don't see those big container tankers like at your tiny small village harbor. They are only in specially designed places where they go and dock and move the cargo around. And for me, that would be a really interesting thing for Star Citizen to introduce, which is the biggest cargo haulers move from space station to space station, and then you need the smaller, more bespoke atmospheric haulers to then bring cargo to the different locations on a planet or moon up to the space station.
Yeah.
And for me, those elements could be quite simple to introduce. Some sort of a hauling mission contract that appears in the contract menu, as well as more differentiation between the different sizes of cargo haulers, because then it's not just a game of how big is your ship, which sadly is a lot of what cargo hauling is at the moment. How much storage do you have? That's how much profit you'll make. Whereas actually, if there's a nuance to saying, well, yes, you're going to move from space station to space station, that's easier for the bigger ships, but maybe the profit margin is lower. Whereas the atmospheric stuff, you're more limited to smaller jobs, but maybe the profit margin is a little higher to account for that. And then, of course, keep open the option of saying, if you want to buy your own cargo and fill your own cargo bay and do it yourself, crack on, have at it, be a privateer and make your money. For me, those would be a couple of elements that would enhance the gameplay versus what we have at the moment.
Yeah. At the very least, we need them to take the courier missions we have right now, which is the other side of cargo hauling, which is basically you go to a certain place, pick up some boxes, get paid a certain amount for delivering them. You don't have to buy those boxes. Expanding that out to 400 SCU would help. Something like that would definitely help. But I agree. I think just like bounty hunting, it's something that we're seeing movement in right now. The cargo refactor started last year. We're going to see another one this year with the introduction of the Hull C, hopefully, and vehicle tractor beams, freight elevators, and the cargo decks, which I think are the first sign that what you're talking about will happen, that we do have these specific cargo ships that are only above a planet. And once you get there, you have to distribute to other space stations or down to the cities or whatever. I really do hope that they follow that sort of format like you're talking about. It makes sense, but they haven't specifically said it yet.
Yeah, I would love to see that. And to be fair, there's another element there that adds more complexity to some of the larger cargo ships, which you mentioned around cargo decks and things like that. Physicalized cargo storage is actually managing the loading of the cargo, what goes where. Yeah. I think potentially there could be some interesting gameplay for some players in that. And I say this carefully, some players, because there'll be some people that are listening to your podcast that go, I just want to shoot space guns. This sounds terrible. Yeah. That's fair enough. But equally, for some people, kind of managing that is likely to be something of interest to them. So things like saying, right, I'm going to 2 different stops. I know I'm going to need to unload aluminium at the first stop, and I'm going to need to unload the rest of my cargo at the second. So I need to make sure that the aluminium is on the top so that gets unloaded first when I get to my next destination. That'll be more efficient. Little things like that. They sound trivial, but actually in terms of building out a more refined mechanic could be very, very interesting for people to learn to manage that stuff and optimize their own journeys.
Yeah, and that's logistics. You're also talking about where you're storing stuff. Maybe there's a system that has a surplus of titanium. So you mine up a bunch of titanium and then you store it at a space station. You do have to pay storage fees for that over the course of weeks, but you know that the price is going to skyrocket at some point and you're going to make a big profit. You could also be the person who has no clue that's happening. You just came into town and you wanted to sell some titanium and pick the worst time. In the same way you said, those people could have stored their cargo one on top of the other in the wrong order, and they're still playing the game. They're still making a profit. They're still doing the job and getting it done and mission complete, but it's not as good. And that skill ceiling is crazy when you start thinking of mass and what type of things you're taking, the temperatures that things need to be at, all things that they've mentioned when it comes to cargo. So that there is a lot of room for cargo hauling gameplay that I'm sure, like you said, to a lot of people is like, what the heck, why? But other people are rubbing their hands together like, ooh, logistics.
Yeah, but that could seep through to other things. And this is that point that we were talking about earlier around critical mass. That logistic stuff, I'm talking about it there in reference to cargo gameplay or potential cargo gameplay. Mm-hmm. That would apply the same to other big ships. So let's say you're flying around your Hammerhead, this corvette that's bristled with guns that is designed to shoot down enemy fighters. Well, at some point, it's got a cargo bay in the back, and part of that cargo bay might be to carry extra ammunition to reload the turrets. So it could be a case of saying, well, I want to use some of that cargo storage around the outsides as ammunition storage so that we can get that back up to the turrets if we want to fire ballistic ammunition from the turrets. So, I've talked about it in the context of a cargo gameplay, but it might also be relevant for some other gameplay loops in the future.
Yeah. Oh man, rearming is going to be interesting how they figure that out. But cargo hauling overall has a long way to go, but it does present some gameplay as we've discussed today. Again, I'll ask, what do you think it is in terms of potential hours of fun for somebody who's interested in that type of gameplay? What is it offering?
I think it's for the right person, it's potentially something they could be very, very interested in for the long term. So if you're the sort of person that is happy just to kick back, almost Euro Truck Simulator style, and plot your route from A to B and grab your goods and sell your goods, I think the potential is already, you can do that as much as you want. I think there are a couple of frustrations that will kick in for people. Things like having to deal with disconnections, like, and this is going to sound weird because Star Citizen is clearly a multiplayer game, but things like dealing with other players. There are some haulers that just don't want to have to deal with other players. Those things could be frustrations for people, but for somebody with the right mindset, I'm sure there is already many, many hours of gameplay in there. It will be very repetitive, but for the people that enjoy it, that's probably part of their gameplay, I guess.
All right. Many, many hours. Cool. Yeah, I think I would agree. You think there's is there enough like supply at this point? Because people are that was really, really messing up cargo for a while. It was like you would go to a place and all of the servers across the world are linked to a single point of sort of distribution. So if somebody on one server empties out an outpost of something, it is also emptied on that other server, which caused a lot of trouble with cargo hauling. Do you know if that problem has been remedied at all with the later patches, these last two?
So as I understand it, that is not a problem. That is design, but players treat it as a problem. So the idea here is that let's pick something that is extremely valuable in the real world. Let's say diamonds. Diamonds in the game are not extremely valuable, but in the real world, diamonds are very, very valuable, and there is a finite supply of them. So you would not fill your massive container tanker full of diamonds, right? You might have one container on there full of diamonds and the rest will be full of other stuff, kids' toys, I don't know, printer cartridges, whatever it is that these container ships fly around. Most of it is not high value, high profit, high yield stuff. So I think the game design is trying to acknowledge that and say, hey, if you want to run, these highest profit items, they'd probably be more efficient on smaller ships. And if you're on a larger ship, you need a lower yields but higher volume thing. The challenge you've got is players, of course, want to make the most possible money that they can. And so they research. Now, a lot of these cargo haulers will do their research. There are tools out there to say, right, what is the single most profitable cargo run I can take? And it says, oh, buy all of this really expensive stuff and move this around, and expect that that's what they're going to be doing. It's not that simple and straightforward. So I think that's by design rather than a bug or a problem or anything like that. And I think it's probably something that people just need to get their heads around to say, there isn't one single place. And the vision to me seems to be that in the future, all of these pricing and different locations and things like that will be much more, they'll be moving at the same time. So it won't be just do this route and continue to do this exact same route over and over again, buying and selling the same stuff. Supply and demand will start to level out a bit more. It'll be all linked to the ongoing economy of the game world. And so it will be a skill that players will need to understand. Where is supply? Where is demand? How is that changing? How do I respond to that? So I think things are better. I guess in answer to your original question, I think things are better in terms of that supply and demand. I don't think we'll go back to the days of old where it was unlimited resources and you could just haul the single most profitable thing. I think there is going to be more nuance to this than that, but that's just my opinion.
My thing is mainly that there are so many people, at least supposedly, I guess, even both physically and uh, representatively, there really isn't a high population in Stanton right now. And that kind of gets to me because I keep thinking of Stanton as this massive place with millions and millions, if not billions of people traveling around at all times. And then you're like, oh, I just sold out this outpost here. But again, these places are still very, I guess the game overall has a sense of not being highly populated yet. So maybe they haven't started to raise that ceiling for materials. Because I do see that with some of the smaller types of materials like like waste or scrap and stuff like that. But like titanium selling out from a mining outpost just in one go always comes off as a little strange.
But again, I think that's where the eventual balancing of different ship types, I think, will help. If you are in that small cargo hauler, I expect you would be able to buy like a full cargo hold worth of the stuff and move that around. Whereas if you were in one of the gargantuan big ships that is not necessarily designed for that, then yeah, I would expect you would run out. And again, that might all play into the supply and demand mechanics. I know this isn't a cargo hauling podcast, so I'm going to try not to go too deep, but let's say that you've got loads and loads of people moving from the planet surface to the space station. Well, then there's going to be more of that valuable agresium or scrap or whatever it is that you're wanting on the space station, which means that potentially a cargo hauler, a big ticket cargo hauler, could fill up on more of that stuff, whereas if you've got less of that, it might make those missions more valuable. So I think this is where kind of the ecosystem of the game will need to develop. But yeah. I think there are some nuances within that sometimes I feel get lost on some players, that some of these changes are intentional and by design, rather than just, you want to be able to, whatever ship you're flying, make the most possible money every single time and just repeat the same thing over and again. I don't know that that's necessarily the direction of travel for the game.
Once again, it's gameplay that just doesn't have all the tools needed to make the most of it. I think you just made a really, really good case for like a setup where the space station is constantly spawning missions asking for a material. And as those materials fill up, as players take those missions, it starts sending out other missions for players to come pick it up and take it to other places from that station. Just like that sounds like such a dream for a space sim. And I'm sure there are other space sims that do that, like X4. That sounds like something that would do. But I would love to see that in Star Citizen and see a way for cargo haulers to understand what their manifest is made of, which we've seen that they've already started to work on, and also understand how they can organize that manifest based on their stops, like you've been saying over the last couple minutes. That's
definitely
an exciting...
I think as well, it's a way to be more overt about the risks and rewards involved. So, I've talked about this before with yourself, with Avenger 1, with others. I think one of the challenges for this kind of gameplay at the moment is that there's a mismatch between player expectations. So some cargo haulers think that they're flying around in the starter zone, so it should be safe. Equally, some PvP players think, hey, this is Star Citizen, it's the Wild West, anything goes. Why are people complaining that I'm shooting them up? I think with those kind of missions, you could then start to differentiate, say, hey, I've got a delivery to Grim Hex. I'm going to pay you a bit more for it, but don't be surprised if you get attacked en route. This is part and parcel of the risk and why we're paying you the money. Equally, it might be hey, you're just going to go to New Babbage and it's going to be easy going and you don't need to worry about other players so much. And so, the pay is a bit lower, but the risk is also going to be lower because we've got UEE ships patrolling that route, etc. So I think, the other thing you could start to do with these missions is have more dynamic risk and reward elements, which again reminds players about the choices that they're making for how much they want to engage with making the huge profit but taking the risk, or making the smaller profit but having less to worry about.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about salvage. I think that would be one of the next ones coming up. This is a newer one. What is your full opinion on salvage right now?
So I like salvage. I think it's interesting. I think it's at quite a basic level at the moment, but I'm okay with that. I would much rather see more and more gameplay loops introduced at a basic level and then kind of built up on later, because I think that just adds more variety.
Yeah.
I think it's it's the new loop, right? So I think people see it as very sexy at the moment, and certainly the last 3 months, there's just been salvaging videos and streams nonstop because it's the new thing, and everyone likes that. And of course, with it being a new thing, the money that you can make from it is, I think, pretty reasonable for the time invested. It's one of the things about Star Citizen being in alpha testing is you'll often see subtle changes made to the amount of money that different activities will earn you in the game, and I think that's a subtle way for the developers to get more testing done on certain elements of the game depending on what they want you doing. I like salvaging. I think that there are different experiences depending on what you want to do. You've got the solo or small group salvage with the vulture, and you've got the much larger, more organized group salvage with the reclaimer, and then of course you've got the little hand mining salvage if you're into that as well. For me, it's kind of a nice gameplay loop that is simple enough to get to understand quite quickly, but equally nuanced enough that if you're really into it, you can make the most efficient journey. It's, I think, interesting for a solo player that's kind of geared up around that, and it is a good experience for a multi-crew. Once you've done it a few times, you can have a good time doing it. So I quite like salvage. I think there's still a long way to go to build on that and make the stuff more interesting. But I think as a new gameplay loop, it's exactly what I'd hope for initial implementation. It's interesting for a solo, it's interesting for a group, and provides a platform to build on.
Yeah. I gotta agree. We waited a long time for salvage. I mean, this was like, the first time they said salvage was coming, quote unquote, next year was, I think, 2017. And they said it was coming in the next year every year since then. So it was like, this was painful for Star Citizen backers. It's nice that we finally have it in game. If you're just jumping into the game right now and salvage is here, just know it is monumental. But like you said, it's still pretty basic. I think it does a great job of scaling up also with the reclaimer. It's a different experience, and I really enjoy that. And I'm also really impressed by the very quick follow-up, bringing it up another step with physical components and weapons. While the missions haven't taken advantage of that for whatever reason, assuming it's pricing, the ability to do that has made salvage so much more of a one-step sort of thing, or a two-step sort of thing. And it's also started to make me see how, while we might think of these ships as having a certain type of crew, we might think a reclaimer needs a pilot and 2 laser operators, maybe a turret gunner and an engineer. We're not thinking about the fact that somebody's going to have to EVA off and get components, or the fact that somebody needs to be moving boxes around in the back. Like, we're starting to see actual in-game examples of how we need to account for multi-crew. And salvage feels like it's done the most of that so far. Maybe mining.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, I think there are some examples in the combat sphere as well, but for me, I think salvage has more different jobs for people to be getting involved with, and I love that multi-crew style of gameplay. It's maybe 1 day a week that I get to experience it, and the other 6 days I'm on my own. I'm fine with that, but those times when I do get to get together with different players, doing something a bit different and having that variety is really appealing to me. So I think salvage is, at least the initial implementation, has ticked some of that off. I would just hazard to say not all people will feel the same. And if you're in the guy in the back of the reclaimer just moving boxes, you might get bored of that quite quickly. That's fine as well. Star Citizen doesn't have to be, you don't have to enjoy every element of every gameplay loop. Some people will, and the fact that some people will is enough for me.
Yeah. All the things that we're talking about today are not meant to be enjoyed by everybody. That's kind of that's by design. That's what I love about it. You can have somebody who loves cargo hauling and like cargo logistics and bring them along on your salvage mission and just have them do the cargo transfers between your salvage ship and your cargo hauling ship. And even as you're doing something you love, your friend can be doing something they love that's completely different gameplay in the same space, and it's collaborative, and you get paid at the end. What's not to love?
What's not to love?
I really like that. So salvage is at kind of a step 2 with the physical components, but we're looking at hole munching coming later today, along with, again, like we said, bounty hunting and cargo hauling, also looking at improvements that might be coming this year. it is looking very good for next level improvements on these game loops for the foreseeable future. What is your estimate on, let's say, hours of fun from salvage?
So I think I would see this a little bit differently depending on whether you were multi-crew or solo. I think at the moment there is a ceiling on the multi-crew engagement. And I say that carefully because for anyone that's not tried multi-crew salvaging, I would highly recommend it. It's a really fun experience. But as I say, if you're the guy moving the boxes, after a certain number of hours, I think you possibly might get bored of that. That said, the solo stuff, I think for somebody that is interested in, enjoys that gameplay loop, again, you know, the loop is there. You can do it. If you enjoy doing it and spending the time doing it, you know, I don't know that you would necessarily get bored of it because it's that kind of management side of things. But again, that depends on if that's the thing that you enjoy doing. If you're not really into the salvage, there might be a time limit on there. I think the other nice thing about salvage for me is that it's got the, I want to say on rails gameplay, but it's got the kind of procedural contract side of things. But equally, it's one of those where you can just go out and try and find stuff, which I think is also quite interesting and opens up new opportunities. So I think it's probably like the combat stuff. If you enjoy doing it, then probably the world is your oyster. If you're not that into it, then probably it's just going to be a few hours and then you'll move on to the next thing. It depends on your own interests and personality.
I like that format of like they have the missions as a packaged example of it. You do the missions a bit, you get comfortable with it, and then you can go off and start doing the sandbox gameplay as you learn the game and get better at doing it yourself. That's nice. I can't wait to see that for mining.
I think that's key, and I know a lot of what we're talking about today is the almost the new player experience. And for a game as complicated as Star Citizen, and I say that because there's just so many different things that you can do. It's very difficult to learn everything all at once. Compartmentalizing that learning and say, right, you can do a little bit of this and then you'll learn to do more, I think is really valuable. And I like that about salvage. You've got that initial kind of, I don't want to say crutch because the missions are quite interesting and entertaining and lots of people will just continue to do those contracts, but you've got that structure to say, this is what salvage looks like. But, you know, then you can go off and go away and do your own thing. I think that's really powerful in making the complexity of Star Citizen more accessible.
Yeah, I like that. All right, on to the other industrial heavy hitter, mining. This is, would you say this is the most developed game loop?
I think between mining and combat, I think they are the most developed game loops. Yeah.
And what are the highlights of mining in your opinion? What sets it apart from other types of gameplay?
Well, I think when you're talking about kind of the iterations that happen on gameplay loops, so when you were talking about salvage, you were saying this is coming next and this is coming after that. I think mining has had a couple of those iterations already. So we started out with, I'm going to say basic mining, but it was quite a lot at the time, which was kind of just managing the power that your mining laser is putting out and then keeping the mining rock in the green zone. That was kind of the core of the gameplay loop. Then on top of that, they added things like mining modules where you can customize that and it has different impacts. And you've got active and passive modules. So you might need to, as well as managing that bar, you might need to press a few buttons to do some extra things to inject stuff into the rock. And then on top of that, they've gone and said, well, here's these little mining gadgets, which are things that you can put on the rock and change the mining harmonics. So suddenly what is essentially at the core, keep a green bar green, and it still is that at the core, there are suddenly all these little different things that you can do to optimize that experience and make it more interesting. So for me, I think that's why mining is a little bit more nuanced.
And do you feel like those things that they've been adding on, do they feel like they've made enough of a difference to what mining is? Or do they just feel like additional difficulties on top of the original idea of mining?
Well, my opinion is I don't see them as additional difficulties because you can ignore them if you choose to. So for most cases, you can go out with just your mining ship or mining rover or mining gun in your hand and not worry about changing things or adding gadgets and things like that. The core of the gameplay is still accessible. what it does is it adds more optional layers for players that want to get deeper into mining. So if you're really enjoying the gameplay loop and then you want an additional thing to add in to make it a bit more spicy, you can add those elements in, and then that's where you can get deeper down into the mining rabbit hole. And for me, that's quite a clever way of making some of these gameplay systems accessible but also interesting for players to continue. So, you could say the same thing with some of the combat elements is point the gun at the bad guy and hold the trigger and that's combat. Well, yes it is, but eventually, for people it's going to be a lot more than that. It's going to be things like, maybe I want to watch some of Avenger 1's training materials and work out how I'm going to move my ship around, or maybe I want to work out my power triangle and move that around in combat. For some people, they go, no thanks, just want to pull the trigger. But for some people, they say, actually, I'll take the added complexity and the added reward or efficiency that goes with that to get a little bit deeper into the gameplay loop. And for me, that's kind of what we've got in mining at the moment. It's accessible at its most basic level. It's fairly simple to explain the basic premise, but there's also little rewarding rabbit holes that you can flow through if you're interested in the mechanic.
Yeah. And how about the 3.19 updates with mining? A lot more strategy. I was just actually out with my org yesterday in some moles, and there's a lot more strategy and communication involved. It really feels like you have to consider every rock specifically.
Yeah, I think so. I kind of see that more as a rebalancing, because that's probably what it felt like a little bit to me when mining was first introduced. As those changes were bundled on, it made more rocks more accessible to people that knew stuff, and I kind of see the more recent changes as almost a rebalancing back to the, hey, don't expect you can do everything with an unequipped, starting mining ship. So I kind of see it as more of a balance pass than new features, but yes.
And what do you think the future of mining looks like?
I'm interested to see. I think there are some things that will make mining more accessible to other gameplay loops. So I'm thinking here about things like I've seen people using the tractor beam creatively already to swap mining bags between mining ships and things like that. But suddenly, rather than having to go back to a station every time, if there's a way that you can transfer your mining contents to a different ship, and then maybe you've got a couple of people and one's in a cargo hauler and one's in a mining ship, the gameplay of the mining looks similar, but suddenly there's more powerful things you can do to work together, and somebody else is taking that stuff back to home base for you so that you've got longer in the field doing the mining. I think those sort of things for me are the logical next step.
Yeah, the refining gameplay coming in will definitely do a lot to mining as well.
It could do. I own a refinery ship because it seems like it might be interesting, but I'm always skeptical until I actually see it in the game first. Yeah. But potentially, yes.
Never know what they're really going to do with it till they do it.
Exactly.
All right. This isn't necessarily the most developed, but I did miss it before. I think racing. Racing is pretty new in the game and a pretty different way for people to make money. Do you think it's an option for folks and enough for somebody who likes racing to try Star Citizen?
Yes. I think I see it a bit differently, perhaps, to how you framed it up there. I don't think racing is new to the game. I think racing, for me, has been in the game for some time. What is new is the ability to be rewarded for your racing prowess. So previously, there have been communities that have built up around racing in Star Citizen, and that was before it was an officially supported feature. Now there are in-game race tracks and contracts that you can take to make some money from doing that. So for me, I think it's really been driven by the racing community in Star Citizen. A lot of those racetracks were player developed and then incorporated into the game. And I'm not really big into racing. I don't think I'm particularly good at it, but I've got a lot of respect for the people that do, because there's a huge amount of skill involved. And what they've done is they've taken the bare minimum of sandbox and said, hey, I'm going to mold this into something that is fun. And I really like that the Star Citizen development team have recognized that community and said, do you know what? You've made something really interesting here for the people that are interested in racing. Let's give you a couple more tools to play around with. So I think for the people that are interested in that side of things, there's a lot of great stuff out there. And clearly, even before there was official gameplay support, people were doing it. So yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. Racing's got a lot of attention right now. Ships are coming out for it. New race courses are being made both in the Persistent Universe and in Arena Commander. It's a good time to be a racer. That's something to try out if you are interested in just flying ships and not dealing with combat and stuff. But that is, I think, most of the gameplay that's currently available in terms of Gameloops. That was a oh my gosh, that was honestly, I estimated that was going to take us some time, and it ended up being most of the podcast. Unbelievable. I'm actually I'm happy with, maybe not, because a lot of what we talked about wasn't what's existing, but what's kind of being worked on. I'm happy with the direction of all these game loops. It really does sound like we're getting a fully fleshed out spectrum of stuff that you can take part in that is reasonably different in experience.
I think so, and I'm of the mindset that personally, as a player, I would rather see more things at a basic level than fewer things at a very detailed level, because suddenly you can start to knit some of those things together more interesting. So, being able to incorporate basic investigation with basic combat for me is more interesting than a very, very narrow but detailed loop. And I think it also potentially makes the whole ecosystem of how everything knits together a little bit more flexible, because you learn as you go along and you learn about what works and what doesn't work. So I'm actually quite surprised, as we've chatted through as well, how much stuff is already in the game, even at a very, very basic level, and hopefully more to come.
Yeah. Can I ask, what is the next basic game loop that you would like to see them bring into the game? Maybe something that they haven't really said specifically they're working on right now.
Ooh, I think those are two different answers. I think the thing that I'm most looking forward to is, I've already mentioned, I'm really into the multi-crew gameplay. In other games, I tend to pick the support type role. And so engineer style of gameplay, things like repair, power management, component management, for me, that is the most exciting thing that I think I'm going to enjoy in Star Citizen on release. And hearing more about how that sort of stuff is going to work over the past year, for me, is very exciting. I don't know when we will see it. I know it is being worked on. So for me personally, I think that sort of multi-crew engineer repair style gameplay is the most exciting thing on the horizon.
I keep forgetting. That's probably one of the things that excite me the most, and because we talk about so many different game loops with stuff being worked on, I forget engineering is also in there. I keep thinking, what's the first thing I imagine they're going to bring in after this? Refining, but it could possibly be engineering. That's a good pick.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk. Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I got that down. Let's talk about. We've sort of hit off on the gameplay now, and obviously there's quite a bit of it. But the other side of the coin that people are concerned with generally is stability and playability. Right now in 3.19, we're really struggling with specifically 30Ks, it sounds like, but that's not necessarily new. Can you give us a little rundown of the history of 30Ks for anybody who's just humping into Star Citizen for the first time recently?
It's not necessarily new, so that's definitely true. 30K is, it's almost a bit of a meme in the Star Citizen community. It was one that I think we were hoping was on the way out, but it seems to have crept its way back in again. 30K is just the error code for a disconnection from the server, which usually means that whatever was going on in the game, the server has fallen over, is no longer responding, needs a bit of help, and so it's disconnected the players from it. Historically, when Star Citizen was much more rough and ready than it is now, if you can imagine that, it was very rough and ready. It was something that players had to deal with an awful lot. I remember times when you couldn't play the game for an hour before being disconnected. We then saw a period of improvements to that. So things like disconnection protection to acknowledge to people that it can be disruptive when these things happen through no fault of their own. So, maybe the cargo in your cargo ship is still going to be there. And then actually we entered, I think, a period of relative stability with patch 3.17, where those disconnections were quite few and far between. They still happened. They're running an alpha server service, but I remember in 3.17 playing for hours and hours and hours and not having a problem. With the release of 3.18, which I think universally was seen as not the smoothest launch, and now 3.19, which is the slightly more refined but still quite rough version of 3.18, they are more common again. And I think for the seasoned players, that's not new. They will be used to it. I certainly personally remember times when these things were much worse, but that doesn't make it okay for some people. So I think the most important thing is communicating what that means, talking about it, and helping people make an informed choice to say, do you know what? From time to time, this can be quite a rough and ready experience. You will get disconnected from the server sometimes, depending on what you're doing. It can be quite frustrating. That might be okay for you, in which case, crack on, enjoy the game, have fun. Equally, you might say, that's just going to be too much for me. That's going to be too frustrating that I have to go back to my station and claim my ship again. And again, that's fine as well. I think we were talking earlier, and we said sometimes with Star Citizen, you have to take a step backwards to take 2 steps forwards. And at the moment, I feel like with this patch and the 30Ks, we are in that step backwards moment. But I understand from the game developers and watching them kind of talking about this that eventually there are going to be that 2 steps forwards, and it's kind of that uncomfortable position that we're in, where we've gone from a more stable position to a less stable position in order to get to a better place in the future.
Yeah. We've obviously seen a lot of knock-on effects from persistent entity streaming and the things that happened in 3.18, and they continue on. 3.19 was launched on the same code base, obviously showing that they wanted to stabilize the 3.18 code base with another quarter before trying to add a new layer of development on top. So this is something that they prepared for. It's something we knew about. It did, I think, hit worse than we thought. But at this point, with 30Ks being majority of the biggest problem for people, I'm glad that the stability has gotten better. It's going to sound weird, but this quickly. For those who remember 3.0, which was the last time we got a major sort of change to the game, we had 3 full quarters of misery. So I'm glad things are where they are right now. I do hope that they get better, especially before 4.0. But let's talk about other glitches and stuff besides 30Ks, because that's one problem, but it's not the only one. Some people have player unstowed issues. A lot of people are having problems with desync, maybe can't log in. Overall, what is your take on the state of the game stability-wise? Do you think it's reasonable, or are they falling behind?
I think it's difficult to say. So I think we're in that one step back at the moment phase, which is making things feel more difficult for people. And I have a lot of sympathy for the people who do choose to play Star Citizen eyes open, who know there are issues, but have not been able to play because of things like, the character is physically unplayable. So things like prioritizing getting the character reset tool back online have been important steps forward to help those people actually get in the game. Because I think if you can't play, that must be incredibly frustrating. I was quite fortunate through that period personally, but I can feel absolute sympathy for the people that weren't able to even get in the game. I do think, I'm trying to be pragmatic here, I think there's a fine balancing act between dealing with these glitches and problems versus implementing new features. And ultimately, the implementation of new features will introduce new glitches and problems. And in my opinion, there's no point in spending a load of time polishing things that don't matter, like NPCs standing on chairs, when there's so much more gameplay to work on first. But equally, we are at the stage now where lots of people, myself included, play Star Citizen to play Star Citizen. And that requires a build that is relatively stable. So I think my opening talk when we were catching up today was, I think lots of people do play the game. It's not finished, it's not perfect, but people play it because it is a playable game. I think there is now an impetus that there is that group of people that says, how do we keep something relatively stable for those? Again, it's very easy to be an armchair critic here, so I know that the developers are working very, very hard to keep things moving forward, and sometimes that is going to mean new glitches, new problems, things introduced. So my priorities would be, how do I keep players able to get into the game, and insofar as possible able to keep playing the game? So things like character or account breaking issues need to be an absolute priority to fix. But out with that, I think there are going to be a different level and severity of different glitches and problems, and I think there's a judgment call to be made to triage those and decide how game breaking is that versus, do you know what, can we just park it and not worry about it? The NPCs standing on chairs is probably a good one of those examples for me. It's weird, it's creepy, it's definitely not polished, but it's not game breaking. You just walk past it and move on. It doesn't stop you getting into the game. So for me, it's probably not a priority, even though it's a visible glitch.
Yeah. And that's got to be the hardest part of this whole project, is that sort of battle between building a game that depends on a lot of tech that they just haven't even researched and developed, with an engine that they are building as they're making the game, with a bunch of live servers that they're paying for, and maintaining that it's not really traditional. And that's got to be so hard to figure out which glitches are most important to take out, which people do we assign to them, and how long can we take them off of what they're doing to do that?
It must be rough. And through all of that, you've still got a different code base development than you have got feature development. So, we're playing on this 3.19 build at the moment. I have absolutely no doubt that there's somebody somewhere that's on a new, more advanced code base that is already working on features for 3.2, 3.21 and beyond. So, keeping that change control, I have a lot of respect for software developers that kind of make that happen, and I'm sure there'll be people much more knowledgeable than me that could comment on that.
Yeah, for as many problems as Star Citizen has had, the fact that it's still succeeding quite wildly 10 years on and hasn't released a game means that they are not only monetizing correctly, but they're keeping the development running correctly. And with a beast this size, hats off to it. I mean, they haven't collapsed under it yet, and that makes me happy because I love this game. So thank you, CIG. Please continue.
Yes,
we love you.
Absolutely. And I think it's easy for us to have an eye on the future because we've got in our mind what we want to get to as a quote-unquote finished game. But sometimes just having your eye on the past is also quite powerful. And how far this game has come from being that hangar module with the little grey cat PTV in it and the little shooting range and a solo single player experience to what we have now, where you can get a group of players and go off and explore and blast away or do some mining or move some cargo around or break up a salvage hull. How far this game has come is notable. I remember many years ago when multi-crew was first starting to catch its feet, and I remember flying up to a constellation and seeing the person in the other cockpit walking around, and that was huge. That was like mind-blowing for me. To me, now, I just take that for granted. That's just part of the game. Yeah. So sometimes seeing how far the Star Citizen has traveled can also say, do you know what? It's okay that things are still a mess on this, that, and the other, because I'm confident that, in a year, 2 years, 3 years' time, we'll be much further down the road.
It's kind of like playing an old game that you used to play, like that you love. Let's say like a game from 2010 or something that you love, and it still has things going for it that set it apart. But you've played it so much, and it's been around for so long that it's just, yeah, it's good, but it lost that specialty. And then somebody else that starts playing it, they're like, oh my gosh, look at all the stuff here. It's like they're not seeing it being built over time like you did. They're seeing not necessarily the finished product, but the most finished product, which is much more impressive.
So yeah, I think so. And you see that, to be fair, with Star Citizen, I think, has attracted some new big name communities out there. You see them on YouTube. They've got their kind of 1 million plus followers, and then they come across and say, oh, this is Star Citizen. And invariably, the first few times of playing it, it's like, wow, what is this game? Look at all the stuff you can do. And then you get about 6 months down the line. I think you've covered this very expertly. You get 6 months down the line and they're going, what on earth is going on with Star Citizen? It is
They're-
kind of that thing.
They put out that video. It's the 6-month video. Things I would change about Star Citizen.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to have one.
Everybody does, and for those of us that follow the project and are invested in it, it does get frustrating, the things that we don't have or the things that don't work. But for somebody with fresh eyes, clearly, those first few videos from the new person, they're always so enthusiastic, so awestruck about, these are all the things you can do. I think for us, it's probably, let's not lose sight of that as well. There's usually a balance to be struck.
Yeah, I agree. All right. So that's the state of the game right now. Would you suggest people jump in to try it out?
I think it depends on the mindset of the person. And I think anybody interested in thinking about Star Citizen, I think I would just encourage you to do it with your eyes open. So maybe watch some videos, watch a streamer playing the game. I think for somebody who accepts that it's going to be a rocky road, but that there's, fun experiences to be had, for somebody who's potentially playing with friends, I think it can be a really enjoyable experience. But equally, if you know that stuff will just be too frustrating for you, I wouldn't bother yet. I would wait. I would keep an eye on the project and wait until things smooth out a little bit. Maybe check in again in a year or 2 years' time to see how things are. I think it's going to depend on the individual.
Yeah, agreed. If you're really driven and you really like space sims, I think you'll get a lot out of this game. But if you're on the fence, you're just looking for a new game to try out, or you have friends who play Star Citizen and you want to try it with them, I would say wait, hold off, take a look at it, float around it, try out the free flies when they come around. You don't have to spend any money on this game to play it. All right. Last thing I wanted to close up with before we finish off. What is the most important thing that you think they could be doing in this game over the next year? Thinking about game loops, stability, new player experience, anything at all, what do you think holds the most weight?
So I think we've already talked a little bit about stability. I think some of the things that they have been doing around fixing game breaking issues or account breaking issues for people are very, very important. Some people treat this as a game, and I think keeping it running, at least to some extent, for those people is important. I do think continued work on developing some of the back-end stability is important, not necessarily at the expense of introducing new things, but I would hope that by the end of this year, we are all playing a more stable game than we are now. That, for me, was one of the hallmark successes of the very long-running version 3.17, and I would like to see kind of more of that going forward. I think you don't want to run an unstable build for too long because it will switch people off. So I'd like to see that, but I would also like to see more gameplay features. So I think we've talked about some of the possibilities for what that could look like. I don't know what the prioritization would be, but for me, a basic implementation of more things would be really, really good to see. I think it adds variety, creates new and interesting scenarios to keep players interested, and ultimately widens out the verse. So I think those elements for me.
Cool. So you're looking for people to just be able to enjoy the game more. And more consistently, more reliably.
I think so. I would love to come and say, hey, here's my big wish list of I'd like the new pyro system to be introduced on June the 1st. And, I'd like all the big multi-crew combat ships. When can I play on the Javelin and things like that? I would love all of that stuff. It's one of the reasons that I'm excited for the game. But I'm also pragmatic of saying not before it's ready. And I think 3.18 probably reminded a lot of people around that to say, do you know what? This is a game that we play, we enjoy, and sometimes it's better to wait until it's finished baking before jumping in. So I think there's a lot more that I would say in the 5-year plan, but I think for the next year, those would be the elements. Some more gameplay loops would be great to see, and a lot more stability. And then when the other stuff is ready, I'll be very excited to see it and play it.
I think people will appreciate that take. Farrister, thank you again for joining me for another episode of the podcast. Always a joy to talk to you about this stuff. I think we got through a lot of gameplay discussion today. Folks, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. I'm sure we missed something that we could do in there, different types of missions or even sandbox gameplay. Please let us know. There's a lot of gameplay in this game that is surprisingly still not acknowledged by a lot of people. A lot of people think that you can't really do much in the game. So I always like getting a chance to sit down and like actually go and summarize it all. And Farrister, you're one of the top people that I think could have done that. So thanks for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Before you go, one last chance to remind the people where they can find your stuff, also linked down below, but listen to the man.
You'll find me on youtube.com/Farrister. That's got all of my links attached. For anybody that's into some Space Tomato, then we actually did some work on a video together recently. So check out the joke April Fool's Grey Cat PTV review if you want to see both of us in action. But yeah, youtube.com/Farrister.
Yeah, the Grey Cat is an impressive beast. Go check it out. One of the best ship reviews I've seen this year. Thank you, everybody, again, for coming to another week of the launch sequence. As always, it could be your #1 spot for Space Game and Star Citizen news. Whatever spot it is, though, I'm just happy that you're here to listen in and enjoy some of it. We'll be back next week, as always, and if you'd like to come and watch these live, feel free to jump in as a supporter, Patreon, as a YouTube channel member, or as a Twitch subscriber. You can come and listen live and get a chance to watch some of our more exclusive videos that we do. Anyways, folks, thanks again, and I'll see you all next week.